Greetings bibliophiles and welcome back to The Book Thing. Today I'm going to be covering a novel that I've picked out for a very specific reason, namely because it's been recently announced by Amazon that they're going to make an adaptation of it. If you've been following any kind of nerdy news sites at all, that of course is going to be a dead giveaway that I'm talking about Consider Fleabas, or possibly Fleabas, I never quite know, by Ian M. Banks, which is not only the first of his sci-fi novels to be published, but also the first one that features the culture and that entire universe. Banks had already had several novels published by the time this came out in 1987 under Ian Banks. Famously, the M was added for his sci-fi offerings, as his publisher at the time was skittish about the obviously completely absurd idea that an author could write genre fiction and non-genre fiction at the same time and still be taken seriously. In the end, he wrote nearly as many sci-fi novels as non-sci-fi works, 14 versus 13, although it does become 14 versus 14 if you count the one volume of short stories that he published. And on top of that, of course, there were two non-fiction publications as well. Of those 13 sci-fi novels, 9 of them were set in the culture universe, so I think it's probably safe to say that at least as far as his genre fiction is concerned, it will almost certainly be the culture works he'll be most remembered for. Now, this isn't the first time I've covered the novels of Mr. Banks, of course. One was Against a Dark Background, which was one of the non-culture sci-fi books, and in some ways that was thematically an inversion of a lot of the ideas that lie behind the culture series, and I do recommend that one to go and listen to if you have some interest in Banks generally, and you haven't read that particular book, because it's actually one of the episodes that I'm most pleased with, weirdly enough. Anyway, the other one was The Hydrogen Sonata, which was the last of his published sci-fi novels and the final one to feature the culture. So I can draw a kind of line here between Hydrogen Sonata and Fleabas. That was one that was concerned in a lot of ways with the beginning of the culture, whereas Fleabas is in some ways about the death of the culture, or maybe rather it would be more accurate to say the death of one version of the culture. Both, however, do share one very important commonality, a central character who is an outsider, not only to the culture itself, but to their own respective societies as well. Personally, I think this was a pretty clever move as far as our introduction to this seemingly wonderful communistic semi-anarchic spacetopia goes, because in the case of Fleabas's protagonist, one Bora Horza Gobuchul, not only is he an outsider, but also someone who is implacably opposed to some of the most fundamental philosophical tenets of the culture, to the point where he's prepared to work for their enemies, because as he sees it, it's not so much who he's working for, it's what he's working against that's important. That in of itself, incidentally, becomes a pretty important point in his development through the story, because for quite a lot of the book, Horza's a bit of a cipher, defined mainly by negatives and absences. Despite convincing himself that he stands opposed to the culture out of a sense of idealism, he never really appears to be satisfied that it's quite enough, and it's only towards the end that the reader gets to see a glimmer of something more about him. An interesting aspect of all this is that he's also a changer, a species not unlike the Tleilaxu face dancers of Frank Herbert's Dune universe, who can, given enough time, radically alter their physical appearance to mimic that of other humans. Horza himself spends a fair majority of the book wearing the faces and identities of other people, and there's a fairly strong implication through it all that this is at least part of the reason why his own personality has become so eroded over time. Anyway, it is, to misquote a famous opening crawl, a period of most uncivil war. The Adirans, a race of theologically driven tripeds, have set about conquering absolutely everything they can for entirely religious reasons, and the culture, in a move that, as the novel says, they managed to surprise even themselves with, decides that they will be the ones to stand up to them. It's against this backdrop that Fleabas happens, a dirty little episode in a dirty great big war that, again, as the novel itself makes clear, isn't even terribly important in the grand scheme of things. So what kicks the story off proper is that one of the culture's minds, those super sophisticated machine intelligences that form such an important part of their society as a whole, for want of a better word, gets shipwrecked on a planet that neither side can immediately access. The culture naturally wants to rescue it because it's one of their own, and they don't want it to fall into the hands of the enemy. The Adherans want it because it represents a chance to get their hands on what might be considered a part of the pinnacle of the culture's technology. Enter Horza, who was at one point a custodian on this planet, one of a small number of a neutral race allowed to remain there by the disembodied, extremely powerful alien entity, one of a species who guard and preserve tomb worlds for their own unclear reasons, barring entry to all those except those who need to land somewhere because they're in distress, such as a certain culture mind whose ship got blown away from under it by the Adherans. And because of Horza's connection to this world, the Adherans select him to go there and try and retrieve the stranded mind. But naturally the culture are not ones to idly sit by and let all this happen, and there is also a further twist in that he is not the only attempt that the Adherans make to retrieve this mind. The plot itself is a fairly straightforward narrative, to be honest. About 2/3 of the book are basically Horza actually getting to Shah's world, which is the tomb planet that I mentioned a moment ago. The final act is all about what happens when he actually gets there. And while I won't give any spoilers, it does quite a good job of ramping up the tension, especially with one particular event that happens. And it ends up feeling like quite a quick section of the book, despite the fact that it's nearly 1/3 of the total length overall. One thing that really doesn't disappoint, whichever part of the book you consider, are the settings in which it all takes place. I'd argue that's always been one of the major strengths of Banks's SF generally, and it's very much on display here, right in the very first sci-fi novel he ever wrote. And I think that was one of his motivations for getting into sci-fi, was to tell big stories against big backdrops, or, well, sometimes smaller stories against big backdrops, and, you know, to come up with the kind of fantastical locations that you really can't do when you're just writing normal fiction. Some of the highlights include a billion-ton ocean-going vessel, the Olmadreka, which is one of many endlessly circling its way around the ring world, well, mini ring world really, of the Vivach orbital. I should maybe make a little note here that orbitals, just for those who don't know, are not quite full-scale ring worlds that go around the equator of a star. Rather, they are smaller but still quite large structures that sit in orbital paths around a star, if that makes any sense. Hopefully it does. Anyway, we also have a race through the innards of a general systems vehicle, of which some types are big enough to hold the population of entire worlds, although this is one of the smaller ones featured in this book. We have a seemingly innocuous jungle temple that turns out to be a little more than what it seems. And of course, there is the denouement of the story, the location where the finale takes place, the carefully preserved tunnel network between the icy ball of Shah's world, which is one of the more interesting locations. It's basically a giant train set, and despite it being a little prosaic, maybe compared to some of the later places that we see in culture novels, it still has a very, very important part to play in the finale of the novel. Now, I do want to talk a little bit more about the culture itself, but I thought I might actually pause here to do my usual thing of reading out a passage from the book itself. In this case, it's right from the start of the novel, where we're first introduced to Horza himself, along with the main representative of the culture in the story, a woman named Perostek Balveda. It had hurt at first when they'd hung him up. His hands, tied inside tight leather pouches, were directly above his head, manacled inside thick loops of iron bolted to the cell walls, which took all his weight. His feet were tied together and left to dangle inside an iron tube, also attached to the wall, which stopped him from taking any weight on his feet and knees, and at the same time prevented him from moving his legs more than a hand's breadth out from the wall or to either side. The tube ended just above his knees. Above it there was only a thin and dirty loincloth to hide his ancient and grubby nakedness. He had shut off the pain from his wrists and shoulders even while the 4 burly guards, 2 of them perched on ladders, had secured him in place. Even so, he could feel that niggling sensation at the back of his skull which told him that he ought to be hurting. That had lessened gradually as the level of waste in the small sewer cell had taken and buoyed up his body. He had started to go into a trance then, as soon as the guards left, though he knew it was probably hopeless. It hadn't lasted long. The cell door opened again within minutes. A metal walkway was lowered by a guard onto the damp flagstones of the cell floor, and light from the corridor washed into the darkness. He had stopped the changing trance, and craned his neck to see who his visitor might be. Into the cell, holding a short staff glowing cool blue, stepped the stooped, grizzled figure of Amhain Frolk, security minister for the gerontocracy of Sorpen. The old man smiled at him and nodded approvingly, then turned to the corridor and, with a thin, discoloured hand, beckoned somebody standing outside the cell to step onto the short walkway and enter. He guessed it would be the culture agent Balveda, and it was. She came lightly onto the metal boarding, looked around slowly, and fastened her gaze onto him. He smiled and tried to nod in greeting, his ears rubbing on his naked arms. "Balveda, I thought I might see you again. Come to see the host of the party?" He forced a grin. Officially, it was his banquet. He was the host. Another of the gerontocracy's little jokes. He hoped his voice had shown no signs of fear. Perostek Balveda, agent of the culture, a full head taller than the old man by her side, and still strikingly handsome even in the pallid glow of the blue torch, shook her thin, finely made head slowly. Her short black hair lay like a shadow on her skull. "No," she said. "I didn't want to see you or say goodbye." "You put me here, Balveda," he said quietly. "Yes, and there you belong," Amhain Frolk said, stepping as far forward on the platform as he could without overbalancing and having to step on the damp floor. "I wanted you tortured first, but Miss Balveda here," the minister's high, scratchy voice echoed in the cell as he turned his head back to the woman, "pleaded for you, though God knows why. But that's where you belong, all right, murderer." He shook the staff at the almost naked man hanging on the dirty wall of the cell. Balveda looked at her feet, just visible under the hem of the long, plain grey gown she wore. A circular pendant on a chain around her neck glinted in the light from the corridor outside. Amhain Frolk had stepped back beside her, holding the shining staff up and squinting at the captive. Apparently it's Amhain, by the way. I was saying it wrong the first couple of times. "You know, even now I could almost swear it was Egratin hanging there. He shook his gaunt, bony head. "I can hardly believe it isn't. Not until he opens his mouth, anyway. My God, those changes are dangerous, frightening things." He turned to Balveda. She smoothed her hair at the nape of her neck and looked down at the old man. "They are also an ancient and proud people, Minister, and there are very few of them left. May I ask you one more time, please? Let him live. He might be—" The gerontocrat waved a thin and twisted hand at her, his face distorting in a grimace. "No! You would do well, Miss Balveda, not to keep asking for this assassin, this murderous, treacherous spy to be spared. Do you think we take the cowardly murder and impersonation of one of our outworld ministers lightly? What damage this thing could have caused? Why, when we arrested it, 2 of our guards died just from being scratched. Another is blind for life after this monster spat in his eye. However," Amhain Frolk sneered at the man chained to the wall, "we took those teeth out, and his hands are tied so he can't even scratch himself." He turned to Balveda again. "You say they are few? I say good. There will soon be one less." The old man narrowed his eyes as he looked at the woman. "We are grateful to you and your people for exposing this fraud and murderer, But do not think that gives you the right to tell us what to do. There are some in the gerontocracy who want nothing to do with any outside influence, and their voices grow in volume by the day as the war comes closer. You would do well not to antagonize those of us who do support your cause." Balveda pursed her lips and looked down at her feet again, clasping her slender hands behind her back. Amahane Frolk had turned back to the man hanging on the wall, wagging the staff in his direction as he spoke. "You will soon be dead, imposter, and with you die your master's plans for the domination of our peaceful system. The same fate awaits them if they try to invade us. We and the culture are—" He shook his head as best he could and roared back, "Frolk, you're an idiot!" The old man shrank away as though hit. The changer went on, "Can't you see you're going to be taken over anyway? Probably by the Adirans, but if not by them, then the culture. You don't control your own destinies anymore. The war's stopped all that. Soon this whole sector will be part of the front unless you make it part of the Idiran sphere. I was only sent in to tell you what you should have known anyway, not to cheat you into something you'd regret later. For God's sake, man, the Idirans won't eat you." "Ha! They look as though they could. Monsters with 3 feet, invaders, killers, infidels. You want us to link with them? To 3 strides tall monsters? To be ground under their hooves? To have to worship their false gods? At least they have a god, Frolk. The culture doesn't." The ache in his arms was coming back as he concentrated on talking. He shifted as best he could and looked down at the minister. "They at least think the same way you do. The culture doesn't." "Oh no, my friend. Oh no." Amahane Frolk held one hand up flat to him and shook his head. "You won't sow seeds of discord like that." "My God, you stupid old man," he laughed. "You want to know who the real representative of the culture is on this planet? It's not her," he nodded at the woman. "It's that powered flesh slicer she has following her everywhere, her knife missile. She might make the decisions, it might do what she tells it, but it's the real emissary. That's what the culture's about. Machines. You think because Balveda's got 2 legs and soft skin you should be on her side? But it's the Adirans who are on the side of life in this war. Well, you will shortly be on the other side of that." The gerontocrat snorted and glanced at Balveda, who was looking from under lowered brows at the man chained to the wall. "Let us go, Miss Balveda," Amahane Frolk said as he turned and took the woman's arm to guide her from the cell. "This thing's presence smells more than the cell." Balveda looked up at him then, ignoring the dwarfed minister as he tried to pull her to the door. She gazed right at the prisoner with her clear, black-irised eyes and held her hands out from her sides. "I'm sorry," she said to him. "Believe it or not, that's rather how I feel," he replied, nodding. "Just promise me you'll eat and drink very little tonight, Balveda. I'd like to think there was at least one person up there on my side, and it might as well be my worst enemy." He had meant it to be defiant and funny, but it sounded only bitter. He looked away from the woman's face. "I promise," Balveda said. She let herself be led to the door, and the blue light waned in the dank cell. She stopped right at the door. By sticking his head painfully far out, he could just see her. The knife missile was there too, he noticed, just inside the room. Probably there all the time, but he hadn't noticed its sleek, sharp little body hovering there in the darkness. He looked into Balveda's dark eyes as the knife missile moved. For a second, he thought Balveda had instructed the tiny machine to kill him now, quickly and quietly while she blocked Amahane Frolk's view, and his heart thudded. But the small device simply floated past Balveda's face and out into the corridor. Balveda raised one hand in a gesture of farewell. "Bora Horza Gobachul," she said. "Goodbye." She turned quickly, stepped from the platform and out of the cell. The walkway was hoisted out and the door slammed, scraping rubber flanges over the grimy floor and hissing once as the internal seals made it watertight. He hung there, looking down at an invisible floor for a moment before going back into the trance that would change his wrists, thin them down so he could escape. But something about the solemn, final way Balveda had spoken his name had crushed him inside, and he knew then, if not before, that there was no escape. I hope it's not too much of a spoiler to say that he does indeed get out of that particular scrape, otherwise there wouldn't of course be much of a novel to follow it. Despite being one of the strongly underlying themes of Flebas, though, that section right there is pretty much the most direct view that we get of Hawser's view of the culture, and it does come up through the rest of the novel, and it does of course help set the tone for the rest of the novel, but it's not like the entire rest of the novel bangs on solely about that. It is much more action focused for a large part of it, but it's all against that idea that Hawser really doesn't like the minds and the machines of the culture. That's his big beef with them, and that he basically considers them to have given up their free will almost to live in this carefully sculpted society. Now, this is probably a good moment to talk a little bit more about the culture itself, because of course this is the first culture novel. This is the introduction that we have to this society, all of course from the perspective of an outsider. So how the culture works is it's this kind of amalgam society that was actually brought together from multiple different founding species, and that was one of the things that we learned in Hydrogen Sonata, in fact. The protagonist in that book was actually a member of a species that almost became one of the founders of the culture, but in the end kind of pulled back at the last minute. So the culture itself is a deliberately highly artificial society. It is one in which the vast majority of people kind of just do what they want, basically. And it really is the minds, these vast, incredibly powerful machine intelligences that make the whole thing work. And so if you take the minds out of the culture, there really wouldn't be a culture. It's interesting, really, that despite this being one of the themes of the novel, you don't really ever truly get an idea of how Hawser came to feel this way, if there was some specific incident, or if this is just pure ideology, which I suspect it is. As I said earlier on as well, this is one of his defining characteristics throughout the book. He is a person who is defined by negatives, and we do learn a little bit about his own culture as well, and there's actually a little bit in the epilogue as well that says the Changers get wiped out during the course of the Adiran War, because it's a long-running war. It lasts for decades, and it is an event that gets not infrequently referenced throughout the rest of the culture novels as well. So you have this rather communistic utopian society that is entirely artificial in nature, and actually, that having said, we don't maybe get that much of a sense of how he came to this view. I think it's that artificiality in part that really bugs him, and it's one of the things that the Adirans we learn really despise about the culture as well. That it is this kind of it's not a natural society, and it therefore isn't going to have the life cycle of a natural society. It's this kind of artificially stable thing. And having said that, the culture itself, and again we learn this in later books, and in fact we partly learn it in this book, it is always fraying around the edges. There are always little breakaway parts that go off and do their own thing and form their own societies that sometimes, in response to events like this, and sometimes it's just things they think the culture should be doing differently, and so they go off and do the thing differently and form their own little kind of daughter societies or whatever you want to call them. And this actually happens in the book. There are a quite a big segment of the culture that really disagree with the culture's decision to go to war, and so they split off, and this is like one of the first big schisms that we learn about in the culture. But the culture is really big. That's the other thing about it. It is big and sprawling, And so, although they seem spectacularly unsuited to a fight, for the Adirans, it's like Germany invading Russia. There is just so much of the culture out there that the culture spends literally years falling back and just building up war materiel before it finally goes on the offensive. So the whole idea is itself quite interesting. This was not supposed to be some perfect society. Some of the criticisms that Hauser and others make of it are entirely valid, you could say, because it isn't a natural society, and it exists in an entirely hypocritical state, because although it is fairly anarchic, and the minds effectively run the culture, but for the decision to go to war, for example, they basically took a vote and everybody decided, and it was that decision that led them into war. It wouldn't be possible for this society to run without the minds. And so you end up with this really kind of like liberal interventionist society, but in a lot of ways they're very sneaky about it, because on the face of it, they're like, oh, it's all about personal freedoms and everyone gets to do what they want to do. But they go around interfering in a lot of other people's societies as well, sometimes in a very subtle way. And the only two kind of governmental structures that really exist within the culture are contact, which is essentially, let's call it the foreign ministry. They deal with the external relations. And it is a group of minds and a group of like humans and other types that all do this on a kind of voluntary basis, but they get picked by other members of Contact, essentially. And then within Contact, you have the clandestine service of Special Circumstances. And it's kind of an acknowledged hypocrisy of this society that they have to meddle and interfere, and sometimes not even have to. Sometimes they do it just because they think that it's the right thing to do from their ivory towers, you could almost call it, because they are very, very sure of themselves, the culture, in a lot of ways. That they always, they like to claim the moral high ground wherever possible. And so sometimes you have this very high-minded, very free, very liberal society doing quite dastardly and underhanded things in order to ensure that they can retain their own little corner of the universe the way it is. And not only that, but they are in their own way quite expansionist as well. They gobble up other species and societies along the way. And from a individual personal perspective, the culture would be quite a nice place to live, but it's also a very dissolute place. And later on, when we get to explore the culture a bit more, you get lots and lots of people just doing more or less useless things to pass the time, essentially. You even get people that will put themselves into long-term storage, essentially, for sometimes thousands of years, just because they got bored and they want something interesting to be happening. So it is a really flawed utopia, although the idea of utopia is itself inherently flawed. I don't know how many people listening to this will have ever read Thomas More's Utopia, but it would be a really sucky place to live. I mean, he tried to envisage this society of perfect Christian moral goodness, which on an individual level would really suck. It would not be a nice society in which to live, even if the society itself was geared towards this idea of, perfect goodness. And so the culture reflects that in some way. It's a really nice place to live, in contrast to More's vision, but in order to be a really nice place to live, it has to do some dirty deeds along the way. So it might claim the moral high ground, but at the same time, it's an entirely hypocritical position sometimes, because they have to do things that the vast majority of the culture would not approve of. And in some ways, it's a society where, even though there's a high degree of freedom of information, a lot of people would prefer to look look the other way and not think about the things that the culture itself has to do in order to survive as it does. So it's an interesting and complex idea, the culture. It's not some completely idealistic vision of the future. I mean, we're not talking the United Federation of Planets here, not by any means. And so I think this is why it comes down to what I was saying earlier, that this is going to be the thing that Banks gets remembered for in the long term, is the culture novels, even though if you look at his total number of works, the culture novels are actually in a minority. Because it's just such a complex, interesting, flawed society. And the stories that he told about that society really do try and unpack that idea, sometimes more directly, other times in a more incidental way. So, time to wrap this up, I think. Personally, I am really looking forward to the Amazon adaptation. I think I'm going to have to buy myself a Prime subscription, even if it's just for the duration of watching Consider Fleabas. The person they've got at the helm of it is actually the guy that came up and produced and directed and wrote the show, well, I don't know, some of those are true, Utopia, which, well, we've been talking about Utopia, so that's highly appropriate, which I've also covered on this channel. It is a British TV production that almost got picked up by HBO for a series as well, and sadly wasn't, but just the 2 seasons that came out on Channel 4 in the UK, I think are highly worth a watch, and it gives you some idea of what we might be in for. If nothing else, stylistically, it might be quite interesting, and it does show that, because Fleabas is kind of a dark book in places, it does show that we have somebody in charge of this adaptation that is willing and can handle a darker story. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and I really hope it doesn't suck. So that's it for this episode of The Book Thing. If you found this an interesting or useful whatever, you can say so in the YouTube comments. You can hit the like button. You can sub to this or my main channel if you haven't already. And as always, stay tuned for more.